I sat there in absolute silence as my father-in-law slid a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany table. He had a smug grin on his face, the kind a man wears when he thinks he's holding all the aces. "There's $50,000 inside, Ethan," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Take it, sign the papers, and walk away." My wife, Sarah, wouldn't even look me in the eye. She was sitting next to another man, a guy wearing a suit that cost less than my watch, and she looked relieved. They all thought they were discarding a broke, unambitious freelancer who was dragging their family reputation down. They thought they were buying my silence. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just Ethan, the struggling consultant. I was the anonymous angel investor who had secretly pumped $11 billion into their failing company just to keep the lights on. I owned them, and the moment I picked up that pen, I wasn't signing my surrender, I was signing their warrant. Welcome back to Inspiration Seeker. If you enjoy stories about hidden identities, betrayal, and satisfying karma, make sure to hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment saying, "I'm ready," so we know you're with us. Now, let's find out how I destroyed their world without saying a word. To understand why I let my wife's family humiliate me, you have to understand who I really am. My name is Ethan, and if you met me on the street, you'd probably mistake me for a high school history teacher or maybe a freelance graphic designer. I drive a 4-year-old sedan, I wear off-the-rack shirts, and I live in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the city. I prefer it that way. But legally, my name is linked to Blackwood Capital. Under the pseudonym E.J. Blackwood, I manage a portfolio worth billions. I made my fortune in tech startups and aggressive stock trading in my 20s. By the time I turned 30, I had enough money to buy small countries, but I had zero interest in the flashy lifestyle. I had seen what money did to people. It turned friends into leeches and lovers into gold diggers. I wanted something real. That's why, when I met Sarah 5 years ago, I never told her about the money, not a single cent. I introduced myself as a freelance business consultant. It wasn't a lie. Technically, I do consult mostly for my own companies, but I downplayed my success. I wanted her to fall in love with Ethan the man, not Ethan the bank account. And for a while, she did. Or at least, I thought she did. Sarah is the daughter of Robert Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics. It's a massive conglomerate, old money, prestigious, but rotting from the inside out. When we got married, Sarah was sweet-driven and seemed to appreciate my simple life. But as she climbed the corporate ladder at her father's company, something changed. The simplicity she used to love started to look like failure to her. She began bringing her work, stress home. Sterling Dynamics was hemorrhaging cash. The market was shifting, and her father, Robert, was too stubborn to adapt. The irony was suffocating. Every night, Sarah would come home and complain about the mystery investor holding the company's debt. She would say, "This E.J. Blackwood guy is the only reason we haven't gone under. Ethan, he holds $11 billion in shares. That's power. That's success." She would look at me with this mix of pity and disappointment and say, "Why can't you be more ambitious? Why are you okay with just getting by?" It took every ounce of my self-control not to laugh. She was idolizing E.J. Blackwood while treating her husband like a loser, never realizing we were the same person. I kept the secret because I was waiting. I was waiting to see if she would stick by me when times got tough, or she was just another person addicted to status. I was testing her loyalty, but I had a sinking feeling she was already failing the exam. The shift in our marriage didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, agonized erosion, like water wearing down a stone. Over the last 6 months, late nights at the office turned into coming home at midnight, or sometimes not at all until the early hours of the morning. I remember one Tuesday vividly. It was raining hard in the city. Sarah stumbled to the front door around 11:30 p.m., looking disheveled but wired. She dropped her designer bag on the floor and didn't even look at me. When I walked over to help her with her coat, the smell hit me instantly. It wasn't her usual perfume. It was a mix of stale whiskey and a heavy, musky men's cologne. Something expensive, aggressive, definitely not mine. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. I wanted to see if she would lie to my face. She pulled away from my touch as if my hands were cold. "You have no idea, Ethan," she snapped, kicking off her heels. "We're dealing with a merger that could save the company. High-stakes stuff. You wouldn't understand. What did you do today? Design a logo for a bakery." The jab was unnecessary, but it had become her default setting. She needed to make me feel small to make herself feel big. I had actually spent the day on a secure conference call authorizing a $100 million liquid asset transfer to stabilize a tech firm in Silicon Valley. But I just nodded. Something like that. I replied, "I made dinner. It's in the fridge." "I ate," she said dismissively, walking past the kitchen without a glance. She pulled out her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen. When I walked up behind her, she instinctively tilted the screen away and locked it. The passcode had changed. I saw the flash of a contact name, Chad. Before the screen went black. "Who's Chad?" I asked. She spun around, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. "He's the VP of sales, Ethan. God, stop being so insecure. Just because you're stagnant doesn't mean the rest of us aren't networking. Men like Chad are out there making things happen. They take risks. They don't just sit in an apartment playing it safe." That word again. Safe. She said it like it was a disease. I looked at my wife, really looked at her, and realized she was gone. The woman I married wouldn't have cared about titles or net worth. This woman standing in front of me was measuring my value against a bank statement she couldn't see. I didn't fight back. I didn't scream. I just watched her walk into the bedroom and slam the door. I slept on the couch that night. Not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't stand the proximity of someone who viewed me with such contempt. I told myself I was giving her one last chance to pull back from the edge. But deep down, I knew the crash was coming. I just didn't know how brutal the impact would be. The silence in our apartment had transformed from awkward to suffocating. It hung heavy in the air, like the humidity before a thunderstorm. By Friday morning, I knew the storm was finally about to break. I was sitting at the kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear. Sarah walked in, fully dressed for the day. She wasn't wearing her usual office attire. She was wearing a crisp white dress, the kind she wore to high-end charity galas or formal family gatherings. She looked perfect, pristine, and completely detached. She didn't pour herself a cup. She just stood on the other side of the island, her hands gripping the marble countertop. So tight her knuckles were white. "We're going to Hamptons this weekend," she stated. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an invitation. It was a directive. I looked up, meeting her gaze. Usually, a weekend at the Sterling estate meant awkward brunches and pretending to care about polo matches. But the look in her eyes told me this wasn't going to be a leisure trip. Her eyes were devoid of any warmth. It was the look a CEO gives an employee right before they hand them a severance package. "Why the sudden trip?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "I thought you were buried in the merger work." "My father wanted to have a word with you, Ethan," she said, her voice flat. "He thinks it's time we all sat down and had a serious conversation about the future. About our future. The phrase 'we need to talk' is the universal signal for doom in any relationship. But when it involves Robert Sterling, it's closer to a court summons. I knew exactly what was happening. Robert had likely been poisoning her ear for months. And now that the company was in dire straits, they needed to trim the dead weight from their lives to focus on survival. I was the dead weight. I could have stopped it right there. I could have pulled out my phone, logged into my brokerage account, and showed her that E.J. Blackwood had just increased the stake in her father's company to 51%. I could have ended the charade instantly, but I didn't. I wanted to see it through. I wanted to see exactly how they planned to discard me. "Okay," I said, setting my mug down with deliberate clink. "If Robert wants to talk, let's talk. I'll pack a bag." Sarah looked almost disappointed that I didn't fight back. She nodded once, grabbed her keys, and walked out. As the door clicked shut, I felt a strange sense of calm. They thought they were dragging a lamb to the slaughter, unaware that they were inviting a wolf into their home. The drive to the Hamptons was a 2-hour funeral procession. Sarah drove her Mercedes with white-knuckled intensity, the radio off, the silence thick enough to choke on. Neither of us said a word as the city skyline faded behind us, replaced by the manicured hedges and gated driveways of the ultra-wealthy. We pulled up to Sterling Estate just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the sprawling lawn. The house was a monstrosity of stone and glass, designed to intimidate anyone who walked up the driveway. It screamed old money, but I knew better. I knew the mortgages on this place were leveraged to the hilt. I knew the upkeep alone was costing them more than their net profit for the quarter. It was a beautiful, hollow shell, just like the family living inside it. Robert Sterling was waiting for us on the front porch. He was a large man, always red in the face, looking like he was permanently 1 minute away from a heart attack or a lawsuit. He held a glass of scotch in one hand and checked his gold Rolex with the other. I stepped out of the car and walked up the steps, extending my hand out of habit. "Hello, Robert." He didn't even look at my hand. He looked right through me, his eyes landing on his daughter. "You're late," he grunted. "Dinner is in 20 minutes. Don't make us wait, Ethan. We have a guest." A guest? That wasn't part of the plan. I followed them inside. The foyer was cold, smelling of lemon polish and arrogance. Robert led us straight toward the living room, and that's when I saw him. Lounging on the leather sofa, looking entirely too comfortable, was Chad. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my car, nursing a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He stood up as we entered, flashing a blindingly white smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ethan, good to see you, buddy," he said, his voice slick with fake camaraderie. He didn't offer a handshake. He just swirled his drink. I looked at Sarah. She wasn't surprised. She walked past me and stood near Chad, the distance between them practically non-existent. Their body language was magnetic. They leaned toward each other unconsciously. It was a slap in the face, so blatant it almost stung. "Chad is joining us for dinner," Robert announced, clapping a hand on Chad's shoulder like he was a son he never had. "We were just discussing the future of Sterling Dynamics. Big things are coming, Ethan, big things. I wanted Chad here to provide a realistic perspective on where the company is headed." I stood there, the outsider in my own marriage, realizing that this wasn't just a family dinner. This was an ambush. And the man sitting on the couch wasn't just a colleague. He was a replacement they had already hired. The dining room was a cavernous space with high ceilings and walls lined with portraits of ancestors who probably wouldn't have approved of what was happening at their table. The seating arrangement was deliberate. Robert and his wife, Eleanor, sat at the heads of the table. Sarah was seated next to Chad, their shoulders brushing every time they reached for a glass. I was placed opposite them, alone, like a defendant facing a jury. Dinner was a masterclass in humiliation. The soup hadn't even been cleared before Eleanor decided to fire the first shot. She peered at me over the rim of her wine glass, her eyes scanning my outfit with undisguised disdain. "Ethan, dear," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Is that the same suit you wore to the Christmas party 3 years ago? It's looking a bit tired around the seams. You know, Chad was just telling us he orders his suits bespoke from Italy. Perhaps you should ask him for his tailor's number. Although, I suppose a tailor like that doesn't work on a freelancer's budget." Chad chuckled, a low, arrogant sound. "It's all about investing in yourself, Eleanor. You dress for the job you want, not the job you have. No offense, Ethan. I'm sure the freelance world is quaint." I waited for Sarah to say something, to tell them to stop, to defend the man she had vowed to love and cherish. Instead, she swirled her wine and let out a small, breathless laugh. "Ethan likes being comfortable, Mom. He's never been one for ambition." That hurt more than the insults. But I kept my face blank, slicing into my steak with surgical precision. I listened as the conversation shifted to business. Robert started puffing his chest out, talking about Sterling Dynamics as if it were still the titan of industry it used to be. "We're pivoting," Robert announced, gesturing with his fork. "We're cutting the fat. The only reason our stock hasn't tanked completely is because of this E.J. Blackwood character. The man is a genius. He sees value where others don't. He's kept us afloat this quarter. Once we secure the next round of funding from him, we'll be unstoppable." I almost choked on my water. It was surreal. They were sitting there, worshiping E.J. Blackwood as their savior, while spitting on Ethan, the failure, sitting 3 feet away. They had no idea that the genius, holding their debt, and the loser, wearing the off-the-rack suit, were the exact same person. I looked at Robert, then at Chad, and finally at Sarah. They were eating up the fantasy, oblivious of the fact that the company wasn't pivoting. It was drowning, and I was the only life raft they had left. The staff cleared the dinner plates, but no dessert was served. The table was left bare, a vast expanse of polished mahogany that felt less like a dining surface and more like a battlefield. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of stillness that precedes a judge reading a verdict. Robert didn't mince words. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He didn't hand it to me. He tossed it onto the table. It slid across the wood with a dry, rasping sound that seemed to echo in the silence, stopping just inches from my water glass. "Let's cut the chase, Ethan," Robert said, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms over his chest. His face was hard, his eyes cold and transactional. "We're all adults here. We all know this. Arrangement isn't working. You don't fit in. You never have. Sarah needs a partner who can elevate her, someone who understands the weight of the sterling name. You're dragging an anchor behind a speedboat." I looked at the envelope, then up at Sarah. She was staring at her hands, twisting her wedding ring, the modest band I bought her 5 years ago, around her finger. She knew what was inside. This was a surprise to her. It was a strategy session they had planned without me. "Open it," Robert commanded. I reached out and flipped the flap open. Inside was a cashier's check. I pulled it out slowly. $50,000. To a struggling freelancer. Maybe this looked like a fortune. Maybe this looked like a fresh start. But to me, the man who had secretly funneled $11 billion into their company just to keep Robert's incompetence from bankrupting them, it was a joke. It was less than what I made in interest in a single hour. It was an insult so profound it was almost funny. "That's $50,000, Robert said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Consider a severance package. Thank you for your time. All you have to do is sign the paper Sarah has prepared, take the money, and disappear. No messy court battles. No alimony. Just go." He looked at me with a triumphant smirk, convinced he had just bought my dignity for the price of a mid-range sedan. He thought he was offering me a lifeline. He had no idea he was handing a loaded gun to the only man who could pull the trigger on his entire legacy. I didn't answer Robert immediately. I just stared at the check, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. I wanted to see who would break first. I expected it to be Sarah, maybe offering a half-hearted apology or a tearful excuse. But I was wrong. Before I could speak, the scraping of a chair against the floor shattered the quiet. Chad stood up. He didn't walk around the table. He strolled over to where Sarah was sitting with the confidence of a man who had already won the prize. He stood behind her chair and placed a hand on her bare shoulder. It wasn't a comforting gesture. It was a claim of ownership. And then, the moment that killed whatever love I had left, Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She leaned back into his touch, closing her eyes for a brief second, as if his hand was the only thing keeping her upright. She finally looked at me, her eyes dry and hard as flint. "It's not just about the business, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "We're in love." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. "In love." I repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity. "You're in love with him? Or are you in love with the title he's about to inherit? Does it matter?" Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "Look at him, Ethan, and then look at yourself. Chad is going to be the next CEO. He can give me the life I deserve. He understands this world. You're just happy existing. I want to live. I want power. I want security. You can't give me any of that." Chad smirked, squeezing her shoulder. "Face it, buddy. You played in the big leagues, and you struck out. Sarah needs a man, not a dependent. We've been seeing each other for 6 months. We don't want to hurt you, but we have a timeline to keep. The company image needs a power couple at the helm, not a CEO and her. Whatever you are." The heartbreak I expected to feel, the crushing weight of losing my wife, never came. Instead, it was replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. I looked at Sarah, clinging to a man who was stealing from the company I owned, thinking she was upgrading. She wasn't just unfaithful. She was a fool. And that realization turned my sadness into absolute, unshakable resolve. They wanted a villain. They were about to get a judge, jury, and executioner. I looked down at the check one last time. $50,000. The numbers were printed in that stark, impersonal font banks use. To Robert and Sarah, this piece of paper was a life-changing amount of money for a poor, naive man like me. They thought they were being generous. They thought they were giving the dog a bone, so he would go bury it in the backyard and stop barking. I picked up the check, holding it between my thumb and forefinger, as if it were contaminated. "Is this it, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of supporting you when you were stressed, holding you when you cried, believing in you when your own father didn't. And this is the price tag you put on that? 50 grand. Sarah rolled her eyes, an expression of pure exhaustion. "Don't be dramatic, Ethan. It's business. Take the money. Start over. Buy yourself a new wardrobe. Just sign the papers so we can all move on. Take it or leave with nothing," Robert barked, slamming his hand on the table. "I'm losing patience." I looked at them, really looked at them. The greed, the arrogance, the absolute lack of humanity. They were perfect for each other. I realized then that staying married to Sarah would have been the real tragedy. Losing her wasn't a loss. It was an escape. I picked up the heavy fountain pen, lying next to the legal documents. It felt cold and solid in my hand. The room went silent. Chad was smirking, already pouring himself another drink. Robert was leaning forward, practically salivating at the thought of getting rid of me. I didn't hesitate. I flipped past the settlement offer and went straight to the signature page of the divorce decree. With smooth, deliberate strokes, I signed my name, Ethan. Then I picked up the check. Robert's eyes lit up. He thought I was accepting the bribe. But instead of pocketing it, I placed it gently back in the center of the table and slid it towards Sarah. "I signed the papers," I said, capping the pen with a satisfying click. "I'm giving you exactly what you want, but keep the money." Sarah looked confused, her brow furrowing. "What? You're turning down $50,000? Are you insane?" I stood up, buttoning my cheap suit jacket, looking her dead in the eye with a calmness that finally made her flinch. "I don't want your money, Sarah. Besides," I added, letting a small enigmatic smile touch my lips, "where I'm going I won't need it. But looking at the way you three run a business, you're going to need every penny you can get." I walked out of Sterling Estate that night and didn't look back. I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently. That silence was my final statement. As I walked down the long, gravel driveway to my aging sedan, I didn't feel the crushing weight of heartbreak I had expected. I felt lighter. The air tasted cleaner. The suffocating pressure of pretending to be less than I was had finally lifted. The drive back to the city was the last time I ever drove that car. The moment I parked in front of my cramped apartment building in Queens, I pulled out my phone. I didn't send any angry texts. I didn't leave a drunken voicemail. I simply went to my contacts, selected Sarah, Robert, and Eleanor, and hit block. Then, I deleted their numbers entirely. It was a digital execution. The next morning, Ethan the freelancer ceased to exist. I listed the apartment for a quick sale, furniture included, and walked out with just a single duffel bag. I hailed a cab, not to a friend's couch, but to 57th Street. The doorman at the Obsidian Tower recognized me instantly, despite my 3-year absence. "Welcome home, Mr. Blackwood," he said, opening the heavy glass doors. "It's been too long." "It has, Henry," I replied. "It really has." Taking the private elevator up to the penthouse, I felt the transformation taking hold. I stepped into my real home, a sprawling multi-level sanctuary with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entirety of Central Park. I stripped off the cheap suit I had worn to dinner, threw it into the trash chute, and didn't give it a second thought. I showered, scrubbing away the smell of that house and the stain of their insults, and put on a robe that cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. I walked into my home office, powered up my secure servers, and logged into the Blackwood Capital mainframe. My lawyers had already reviewed the divorce papers I signed. Because Robert and Sarah were so arrogant, so convinced I was destitute, they had insisted on a clean break clause. They waived their right to audit my assets to speed up the process. They had legally signed away any claim to the $11 billion I had made before and during the marriage. I poured myself a glass of vintage scotch, looked out at the city lights, and smiled. Ethan was gone. E.J. Blackwood was back. And the game was just beginning. 3 years went by in the blink of an eye. For me, they were years of explosive growth. Blackwood Capital expanded into biotech and renewable energy, tripling in value. I was traveling to Tokyo, London, and Dubai, closing deals that reshaped industries. I was busier than ever, but I always made time for one specific hobby, reading the quarterly reports of Sterling Dynamics. I watched them from the shadows, like a hawk circling its prey. In the beginning, it looked like they were winning. Sarah and Chad had a wedding that was splashed all over society pages. It was a grotesque display of wealth. Helicopters, ice sculptures, 1,000 guests. They looked happy in the photos, glossed over with filters and fake smiles. Chad took over as CEO shortly after, just as he had promised. But running a company isn't the same as playing dress-up. Chad treated Sterling Dynamics like his personal piggy bank. I saw the internal memos and the expense reports. He was burning through cash on company retreats to Fiji, branding partnerships that were really just parties for his friends, and a new corporate jet that the company definitely didn't need. The cracks started to show about 18 months in. The stock price, which I had propped up for years, began to wobble. Then it slid. Then it plummeted. They missed one earnings target, then 2, then 4 in a row. The innovation stopped. The good employees, the ones who actually did the work, left in droves because they couldn't stand Chad's arrogance. By the end of the 3rd year, Sterling Dynamics was bleeding red ink. They were on the verge of being delisted from the stock exchange. The rumors on Wall Street were brutal. Bankruptcy was weeks away. I sat in my office one rainy Tuesday morning, watching the news ticker scroll across my screen. Sterling Dynamics shares hit all-time low. CEO Chad Miller under fire. My phone buzzed. It was the chairman of the board at Sterling Dynamics. He didn't know he was calling Ethan the ex-husband. He thought he was calling the mysterious representative of E.J. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood's office. I answered, using a voice modifier I reserved for these specific calls. "We need a meeting." The chairman sounded frantic, breathless. "The bank is calling in the loans. We can't make payroll next month. The board is in a panic. We need Mr. Blackwood to intervene. He's a majority shareholder. If he doesn't inject capital or sign off on a restructure, we go under." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at a framed photo of the New York skyline. "Mr. Blackwood is aware of the situation," I said calmly. "He is ready to step in. But he requires an in-person meeting with the executive team. The CEO, the CFO, and the Sterling family. All of them." Of course, the chairman stammered. "When can he come?" "Tomorrow at 9 a.m., I replied, "and tell him to be on time. Mr. Blackwood hates to be kept waiting." I wasn't physically in the boardroom when the news broke, but I didn't need to be. I had a proxy inside, a quiet, unassuming board member named Marcus who had been reporting to me for years. He described the scene to me later, and I have to admit, I savored every detail. The atmosphere at Sterling Dynamics was less like a corporation and more like a sinking ship where the lifeboats had already been stolen. When the chairman announced that E.J. Blackwood was coming in person, the panic didn't just ripple through the room. It exploded. For 3 years, I had been a ghost to them, a name on a ledger, a signature on a proxy form. To Robert and Chad, E.J. Blackwood wasn't a man. He was a myth, a titan of industry who could wipe them off the map with a single phone call. They had built me up in their minds as this terrifying, ruthless billionaire who ate CEOs for breakfast. They weren't entirely wrong. "We have to be perfect," Robert screamed, pacing the length of the mahogany table, his face a dangerous shade of purple. "This man holds 51% of our debt and equity. If he decides to pull the plug, We are destitute. Do you understand? Destitute. Chad, true to form, was trying to mask his terror with bravado. He was checking his reflection in the glass partition, adjusting his tie. Relax, Robert, he said, though his hands were shaking. I can handle him. It's just business. I'll show him the projections for next quarter. I'll charm him. Investors love confidence. Sarah didn't say a word. According to Marcus, she looked exhausted. The power couple glow had faded long ago, replaced by the harsh lines of stress and the realization that she had married an incompetent fraud. She sat there, staring at the empty seat at the head of the table, the seat reserved for me, with a look of pure dread. They spent the entire night prepping. They scrubbed the financial reports, tried to hide the losses, and rehearsed their pitches. They were scrubbing the decks of the Titanic, while the iceberg was already tearing through the hull. They were terrified of meeting the stranger who held their fate in his hands, completely unaware that the stranger knew exactly what they liked for dinner, what they watched on TV, and exactly how little they thought a husband was worth. The morning of the meeting, the sky over Manhattan was a bruised purple, heavy with rain that hadn't fallen yet. It was the kind of weather that makes the city feel small and claustrophobic. Perfect. I didn't take a cab this time. I didn't drive a beat-up sedan. My motorcade consisted of 3 armored black SUVs with tinted windows, moving in a tight formation that parted the morning traffic like a shark cutting through water. I sat in the back of the lead vehicle, adjusting the cuffs of my bespoke suit. It was Italian silk, charcoal gray, tailored within a millimeter of perfection. It cost more than the entire severance check Robert had slid across the table 3 years ago. We pulled up to the curb of the Sterling Dynamics headquarters. Security had already cordoned off the entrance. As my driver opened the door, I stepped out onto the wet pavement. I took a deep breath. The air smelled the same, exhaust fumes and coffee, but my place in this world had shifted tectonically. I walked into the lobby flanked by 4 of my top attorneys and 2 personal security detail. The transformation was immediate. The receptionist, a woman who used to ignore me when I came to pick Sarah up for lunch, practically jumped over the desk to greet us. She didn't recognize me. Why would she? She saw the power, the entourage, the aura of E.J. Blackwood. She didn't see Ethan, the husband who used to wait by the potted plant. Mr. Blackwood, she stammered, her voice trembling. They are expecting you in the executive boardroom. Top floor. The private elevator is waiting. I didn't speak. I just nodded, hiding my eyes behind dark sunglasses. We swept toward the elevators, a phalanx of intimidation. The ride up to the 40th floor was silent. I watched the numbers climb, my heart rate steady, my mind icy calm. This wasn't just a business acquisition. It was an exorcism. The elevator doors pinged softly and slid open. The executive hallway was lined with nervous junior staffers pretending to work, terrified to look up. My team stopped outside the double mahogany doors of the boardroom. I signaled for my lawyers to wait. I wanted to walk in first. I wanted them to see me. One of the security guards reached for the handle. "Ready, sir?" "Open it," I said. The heavy doors swung inward with a groan. The room was expansive, dominated by a long glass table. At the far end, huddled together like children waiting for principal, sat Robert, Chad, and Sarah. Their heads were bowed, studying papers they weren't reading. They were trembling. They heard my footsteps on the plush carpet, heavy, deliberate, authoritative. They didn't look up immediately. They were waiting for me to speak, to introduce myself as the stranger they feared. I stopped at the head of the table, placed my knuckles on the glass, and leaned in. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Sterling," I said. My voice wasn't loud. I didn't shout. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a man who owns the building, the furniture, and the very air they were breathing. The effect was instantaneous. It wasn't the booming baritone of a stranger they expected. It was a voice they knew, a voice they had ignored, talked over, and silenced for years. Robert dropped his pen. It clattered against a glass table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Sarah's head snapped up so fast I thought she might have hurt herself. Chad froze, his hand halfway to his water glass. They stared at me. For a solid 10 seconds, Nobody breathed. Their brains were trying to reconcile two impossible realities. They were expecting E.J. Blackwood, the titan of Wall Street. Instead, they were looking at Ethan, the failure ex-husband. But this wasn't the Ethan they remembered. This Ethan was wearing a $10,000 suit, flanked by high-powered attorneys, and radiating a terrifying amount of cold authority. "Ethan," Sarah whispered, the color draining from her face until she looked like a ghost. Her eyes darted from me to my lawyers and back again. What are you doing here? How did you get in?" Chad was the first to recover his arrogance, though his voice cracked. "This is a private meeting. Ethan, Jesus, did you bribe security guard? We are waiting for the majority shareholder. Get the hell out before I have you arrested for trespassing." Robert stood up, his face reddening. "This is a new low, even for you. Begging for money? We gave you a check 3 years ago. Get out." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I simply walked to the head of the table, the seat Robert usually occupied, and pulled out the chair. The leather creaked as I sat down. I placed a single folder on the table and folded my hands over it. "Sit down," I commanded. My voice boomed this time, sharp and cutting. It wasn't a request. Chad opened his mouth to argue, but my lead attorney stepped forward, placing a hand on the table. "Mr. Miller, I would advise you to listen. You are addressing the chairman of Blackwood Capital." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a world ending. I looked Sarah dead in the eye. "I am not here to beg, Robert. I am not here to trespass, Chad. I am E.J. Blackwood. I own 51% of this company, and I'm here to collect." The realization didn't just wash over them. It crushed them. I watched as the blood drained from Robert's face, leaving him looking gray and old. Chad slumped back in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, no sound coming out. Sarah just stared at me, her eyes filling with tears, not of sadness, but pure, unadulterated shock. The narrative she had built her life around, that I was a loser and she was a prize, had just been incinerated. That's impossible," Sarah stammered, her voice barely audible. "You lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. You drove a used car. You clipped coupons." "I lived simply because I wanted a life that was real," I said, opening the folder in front of me. "I wanted to know that the person sleeping next to me loved me, not my portfolio. I was testing you, Sarah. I gave you 5 years to prove that you valued loyalty over status. You failed, spectacularly." I slid a series of documents across the glass table. They fanned out perfectly, stopping in front of Chad. "This is a forensic audit of the last 3 years," I announced, my voice hard as granite. "While you were busy playing CEO, Chad, you're also busy funneling company funds into offshore accounts. The yacht in Miami? The consulting fees paid to your brother's shell company? We have it all. That's not just incompetence. That's embezzlement. That's prison time." Chad turned a shade of green I'd never seen on a human being before. He looked at his lawyers, but they were already packing up their briefcases. They knew a losing battle when they saw one. I turned my gaze to Robert. "And you? You sat by and watched him loot the company your father built because you were too obsessed with appearances to admit you made a mistake. You let the stock tank. You ignored the warnings. You breached your fiduciary duty to the shareholders. And since I am majority shareholder, I'm holding you personally liable." "Ethan, please," Sarah interrupted, reaching out across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to touch my arm. "We can fix this. We're family. I was confused. I made a mistake. But I still love you. We can start over. Imagine what we could do together now." I pulled my arm back as if she were contagious. The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, staring into the abyss, she thought she could manipulate me. "We aren't family, Sarah," I said cold. "We're business partners. And I'm afraid I'm dissolving the partnership." I stood up, buttoning my jacket. "I'm initiating a hostile takeover effective immediately. The board has already voted. I'm stripping all 3 of you of your titles, your salaries, and your access to this building." I didn't have to raise my voice. I simply nodded to the head of my security detail. The doors opened, and 4 uniformed guards stepped in. They weren't the building rent-a-cops that Chad was used to barking orders at. These were my private contractors. Mr. Sterling, Mr. Miller, Mrs. Sterling, the head guard said, his voice flat, "Please hand over your badges and company phones. You are to vacate the premises immediately. Personal items will be boxed and mailed to you." Chad tried to bluster, shouting about lawyers and wrongful termination, but the fight had left him. He looked like a deflated balloon. Robert just slumped, the weight of his failure finally crushing his ego. But Sarah looked at me one last time. Her eyes were wet, pleading, searching for a trace of the man who used to make her coffee every morning. "Ethan," she whispered, "what do I do now?" I looked at her, not with hate, but with a strange sense of pity. "You figure it out, Sarah," I said softly, "like the rest of us do. You start over. But this time, try doing it without a safety net." I watched them being escorted out of the boardroom. 3 figures who had once loomed so large in my life, now reduced to nothing but liabilities on a balance sheet. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing the past away forever. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. My team started unpacking files, ready to work. We had a long road ahead to save the company. There were thousands of employees, innocent people with families and mortgages, whose livelihoods depended on Sterling Dynamics surviving this mess. Saving them, not destroying my ex-wife, was the real victory. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the New York skyline. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, letting shafts of golden sunlight pierce through the gray. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I wasn't Ethan the freelancer, and I wasn't just EJ the ghost. I was finally just me. I turned back to the empty boardroom table, ready to get to work. The past was dead. The future was mine to write. And that is the story of how I let them underestimate me, until it was too late. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story from Inspiration Seeker. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Ethan should have forgiven Sarah, or did she get exactly what she deserved? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.